The spare key was gone from the hook by the back door, and I stood there for a full minute just staring at the empty nail like it might explain itself. My name is David. I'm 41, I run regional sales for a medical supply company out of Cincinnati, and that key had hung on that hook for 6 years, the one we gave to Tom next door, for emergencies, for the 2 weeks a summer we'd be at the lake and he'd water the tomatoes. Sarah, I called up the stairs, did you take the spare key off the hook? Tom needed it back for something, she said, not coming to the top of the stairs, her voice carrying down flat and quick. I'll explain later. I didn't think much of it. That's the truth I have to tell first, because everything after only makes sense if you understand how little I was looking. I traveled 3 weeks out of every 4, Dayton, Columbus, Louisville, a rotation of regional offices that had become, over 12 years of marriage, just the shape of our life rather than something either of us questioned. Sarah ran the house. Sarah ran Ella's dance schedule and Noah's soccer and the calendar of a life I mostly experienced through text updates from hotel rooms. I came home that Thursday from 4 days in Dayton, and the key thing bothered me for exactly as long as it takes a tired man to climb a flight of stairs and forget what he was thinking about. I kissed Sarah, I asked Ella about her spelling test, I ate dinner, and somewhere in the ordinary noise of a house with 2 kids in it, the missing key slid all the way out of my mind. I want to tell you the whole story starts there, with that hook, but that's not quite true either. It starts earlier, in ways I only understood how to see much later, in the 18 months before that Thursday, in 100 small absences I'd mistaken for a healthy, self-sufficient marriage. Tom Reyes had lived next door with his wife Priya for 8 years. Good neighbor. Contractor by trade, the kind of guy who fixes his own gutters and yours too if you ask, 44 years old, easy laugh, always around because contracting lets you set your own hours in a way my job never had. Priya traveled for her consulting work almost as much as I did. Which meant that on any given week, our house had an absent husband and their house had an absent wife, and somewhere in that overlap, 2 people who used to just be neighbors had become something I hadn't been paying enough attention to notice changing. I'm not writing this to make myself the victim of my own blindness, though I understand now that's exactly what I was. A man who is gone 3 weeks a month has to trust the person he leaves behind, or the whole arrangement collapses. I trusted Sarah completely. I trusted Tom too, in the unthinking way you trust a man who's fixed your fence and stood at your barbecues for 8 years. It never occurred to me that the trust I'd built my whole domestic life on had a hole in it exactly the shape of the man living 40 feet from my back door. That Thursday night, after the kids were down, I lay in bed scrolling through emails from the Dayton trip, and Sarah came in from brushing her teeth and said, almost carelessly, "Tom's borrowing some of our tools for a job." I told him it was fine. "Which tools?" I said, not really listening. "The ladder, I think. Maybe the drill." She got into bed. "You're never here to use them anyway." She meant it as a joke. I laughed, because it was true, and true things said lightly don't usually feel like warnings. I didn't know yet that, "You're never here," was a sentence Sarah had been carrying around for over a year, turning it over so many times it had worn smooth, the way a stone does in a pocket, until it no longer felt sharp enough to be a complaint. It had just become a fact of her life. A fact she'd started, without either of us quite noticing the shift, to build a solution around. The next 6 weeks moved the way weeks always did in our house, my rotation of trips, Sarah holding the calendar together, the kids growing up in the small increments you only notice in photographs. I want to describe how normal it all felt, because normal was exactly the camouflage everything hid inside. I started noticing, without registering it as noticing, that Sarah seemed lighter on the days I was leaving than she used to be. Not colder toward me, if anything, warmer, more affectionate at the door, a longer hug goodbye than we'd exchanged in years. I told myself business travel had finally stopped being a strain on us the way it used to be in our early years, that we'd simply adjusted, the way couples do. I was proud of that, actually. I thought we'd figured something out other couples hadn't. What I didn't see, because I was rarely there to see it, was the truck in Tom's driveway on weekday afternoons more often than a contractor's schedule should allow, or the way Sarah had started doing her makeup on days she claimed were just errands and pickup lines, or the fact that Ella, in the offhand way kids report things without understanding their weight, mentioned one dinner in early October that, "Mr. Tom comes over a lot when you're at work trips, Dad." I said, "That's nice of him to help your mom out," and passed the mashed potatoes, and the moment closed over like water. Priya was traveling more that fall too, a big consulting project in Chicago, gone Monday through Thursday most weeks. I remember thinking, once, in passing, that it must be nice for Tom and Sarah both, having a neighbor around during the long stretches their spouses were gone. I actually thought that. I thought it was good for both of them. The first behavioral crack I can identify now, looking back, came in late October, small, easy to miss. Sarah had always kept her phone on the kitchen counter, screen up, unlocked, the way people do who've never needed privacy from anyone. Sometime in October, without any announcement, it started living in her back pocket instead, and when it buzzed she'd glance at it and put it away rather than glance and set it back down. I noticed. I told myself everyone gets more careful with phones eventually, spam, scams, whatever. I didn't ask. The second sign came in November, at Ella's school fall festival. Priya was there without Tom, Chicago again, and Sarah and Priya stood together by the cider stand for almost 20 minutes, and something in how Sarah's laugh sounded that afternoon, a half second too bright, too sustained, made me look over twice without knowing why I was looking. I chalked it up to Sarah being a naturally warm person. I've since had to sit with how many times that fall I explained something away by simply reminding myself what a good person Sarah was, as if goodness and deception were opposites rather than, sometimes, just two things a person can hold at once. The third sign, the one that should have mattered most, came in early December. I came home a day early from a trip to Louisville, a client meeting cancelled, and Tom's truck was in our driveway at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and Sarah met me at the door with a laugh that started a half beat too fast. "Tom was just fixing the garbage disposal," she said. "It's been making that sound." I checked the disposal later that week. It worked fine. I never asked when it had supposedly broken, and I never mentioned that I'd checked. I filed it, the way I'd been filing things all fall without quite admitting I had a file. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever built a whole comfortable story out of a series of small, uncomfortable facts, not because you were foolish, but because the comfortable story let you keep sleeping at night, you already understand exactly what that December felt like for me. I didn't know it then. This is what Sarah was living through that same December. On the Tuesday I came home early and found the truck in the driveway. I heard David's car in the driveway 45 minutes earlier than I expected, and my whole body went cold before my mind caught up with why. Tom was still in the kitchen. I remember thinking, with a kind of clarity that scared me, this is it, this is the moment it all falls apart, and then I heard myself say the words about the garbage disposal before I'd even decided to say them, like some other, faster part of me had been keeping that excuse ready for months, just in case. Tom slipped out the side door while I was talking. David never saw him leave. I stood in my kitchen afterward and understood that I had just become a person who could lie that fast, that smoothly, without planning it in advance, and that frightened me more than getting caught would have. That's what she told me, weeks later. That afternoon, I only knew the disposal sounded fine to me. By the time the new year turned over, I had a private, unacknowledged list of things that didn't add up, and I still hadn't said a single word about any of them out loud. I told myself I was a trusting husband. I understand now I was something closer to a man who'd rather not know than risk finding out. January is a slow month in medical sales, budgets reset, decisions stall, which meant I was actually home more than usual for 3 straight weeks, the longest stretch I'd spent in that house in over a year. I hadn't planned it as an experiment. It became one anyway. What I noticed, being home, was how often Tom's name came up in ordinary conversation. Small things, Sarah mentioning he'd recommended a good mechanic, that he'd helped Noah with a science project birdhouse, that he'd stopped by to check the furnace when it made a strange noise in the night. Individually, each of these was the kind of thing a good neighbor does. Stacked together, over 3 weeks of actually being present to notice the stacking, they started to look like something else, like a man who had somehow become load-bearing in my household's daily architecture without my ever signing off on the design. I brought it up once, carefully, over dinner. "Tom's around a lot," I said, trying to make it light. "Priya travels a lot," Sarah said. "He gets bored." "It's not a big deal, David." It wasn't an unreasonable answer. That's what made it hard to push against. Every individual piece of this had a reasonable answer attached to it, and it was only the accumulated weight of all the reasonable answers together that felt, increasingly, unreasonable. The second week of January, I ran into Priya at the mailbox. She was between trips, home for a stretch, and she mentioned, in the easy way neighbors trade small talk, that Tom had been working late on a lot of jobs lately, home past dinner most nights. I said that must be nice, the extra work. She said something that stuck with me longer than she probably meant it to, nice for the bank account, I guess. I barely see him even when I'm actually home. I thought about that for days. If Tom was working late most nights, and also somehow available all those afternoons Sarah had mentioned, the furnace, the birdhouse, the disposal, the math didn't sit right. I didn't say anything to Priya. I didn't say anything to Sarah. I just carried the discrepancy around with me the way you carry a stone in a shoe you haven't stopped yet to shake out. The third week of January, a Thursday, I told Sarah I had an unexpected trip to Columbus, one night, back the next afternoon. I did have a meeting there, that part was true. What I didn't tell her was that I'd rearranged my schedule to be back home by 6 that evening instead of the next day, and that I intended, for the first time in this whole slow unraveling, to actually watch rather than explain away whatever I found. I want to be honest about what that decision felt like. It didn't feel like suspicion exactly. It felt like finally agreeing to look directly at something I'd been looking past for 4 months, and some part of me already knew, driving home early with my overnight bag still in the trunk, that whatever I found waiting was going to require me to stop being the man who filed things away and start being someone else instead. Looking back now, that drive home was the real turning point, not because of what I found at the end of it, but because it was the first time in this entire year that I chose to look rather than choosing, again, to trust the comfortable version. I parked 2 streets over, which is a strange thing to do in your own neighborhood, and walked back on foot, telling myself I was being paranoid, telling myself I'd feel foolish in 20 minutes and would drive properly into my own driveway and laugh about it with Sarah over dinner. Tom's truck was in our driveway again. It was 5:40 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I was supposed to be in Columbus. I stood on the sidewalk across the street for 11 minutes, I know because I checked my phone twice, before I made myself walk up to my own front door like a man entering his own home, which, I reminded myself, I still was. I didn't confront anyone that Thursday. I want to explain why, because it would have been the obvious moment, and I chose, deliberately, not to take it. I walked in. Sarah was in the kitchen, Tom was at the table with Noah, looking at the birdhouse project, and both of them looked up at me with an expression that lasted exactly half a second too long before rearranging itself into normal surprise. "Thought you were in Columbus," Sarah said. "Meeting got moved," I said. "Thought I'd surprise you." Tom left 10 minutes later, easy as always, clapping me on the shoulder on his way out, and I stood in my own kitchen understanding, with total clarity for the first time, that I had just watched 2 people perform normalcy at me, and that I was going to need actual proof before I said a single word, because I already knew, some instinct from 12 years of marriage, that confronting this with only a feeling would get me nothing but a reasonable explanation and a locked door somewhere I couldn't see behind. This is where I made my choice, the one I want to be honest about rather than dress up as something nobler. I decided not to ask Sarah directly. I decided, instead, to gather what I needed quietly, methodically, the way I build a sales territory, data first, confrontation only once the data was undeniable. Some of that was patience. Some of it, I understand now, was the same workaholic instinct that had kept me physically absent from this marriage for years, redirected. I'd learned to solve problems by working harder at them alone rather than by bringing another person in to solve them together. Over the following 3 weeks, I built a case the way I'd build a quarterly report. I set an old home security app on my phone that we'd installed years ago and never bothered to check, a doorbell camera we'd stopped monitoring after the novelty wore off, and reviewed the footage from my away days. Tom's truck, for separate afternoons across 3 weeks, arriving within 20 minutes of my own departure for the airport, leaving within 20 minutes of Priya's projected return each time. I checked Priya's flight schedule, which she'd once shared in a neighborhood group chat about carpooling to the airport. The pattern lined up too precisely to be coincidence. I found a receipt in the recycling for a motel 40 minutes north, in a town neither of us had any reason to visit, dated a Tuesday I'd been in Dayton. I found, on the old family laptop Sarah rarely used but hadn't fully logged out of once, a search history for that same motel from months earlier, a red herring, almost, because for one terrible week I convinced myself this had been going on for over a year, before matching the dates more carefully and realizing the search was from the week it had actually started, not some longer hidden history I'd missed entirely. Small relief, if you could call it that. I want to mention the false leads too, because there were real ones. I spent 4 days privately suspicious of our tax preparer, a family friend Sarah met with quarterly, before confirming through simple math that those meetings were exactly as long and as documented as they should be. I briefly wondered if Priya knew and was somehow complicit, some strange arrangement between the four of us I hadn't been told about. That thread went nowhere the moment I actually looked at Priya's own travel exhaustion and her offhand comment at the mailbox, which had clearly come from someone who suspected nothing. By late February, I had 11 weeks of doorbell footage, a motel receipt, and a travel pattern match precise enough that no reasonable person could call it coincidence. I hadn't said one word to Sarah. I hadn't said one word to Tom. I'd become, without entirely choosing to, a man silently building a case against his own marriage while eating dinner across the table from the person he was building it against. I remember one night in that stretch, lying beside Sarah, feeling her fall asleep against my shoulder the way she had for 12 years, and understanding that I was no longer sure which version of this marriage was the real one, the one where she still reached for me like that, or the one on the footage on my phone. I understood, finally, in the dark, that I wasn't going to get an answer to that question by waiting any longer. I was going to have to choose the moment myself, and make it count. I chose a Tuesday in March, the same day of the week, deliberately, as the motel receipt, as most of the footage. Sarah had told me, that morning, that she had a bookkeeping client meeting downtown that afternoon. I told her I had a trip to Louisville. Neither of us was telling the other the truth, though only one of us knew that yet. I didn't go to Louisville. I sat 2 streets over, in my own car, the same spot I'd parked the day I'd first walked home on foot, and I watched Tom's truck pull into my driveway at 1:15. I gave it 40 minutes. Then I drove home, parked in my own driveway like a man arriving from a normal day, and walked in through my own front door. They were in the living room, not even trying very hard by that point, it seemed, close together on the couch in a way that needed no footage to interpret. Sarah's face did something I'll remember for the rest of my life, not shock exactly, more like watching a structure she'd been holding up with both hands finally understand it couldn't be held up any longer. I didn't shout. I want to explain what actually happened in me, because it surprised me too. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because some part of me, standing in my own living room after 11 weeks of quiet, methodical proof-gathering, found the scene almost absurd in its smallness. All that careful hiding, all those excuses about disposals and furnaces and school projects, for this, 2 people on a couch in the house I paid the mortgage on, 40 feet from the house where Tom's own wife slept most nights of the week. "You're not even going to deny it," I said, and I heard how cold my own voice sounded, precise in a way it had never been with Sarah before. Tom stood up fast, said my name like he had some sentence ready, and I looked at him and said, "Get out of my house," in a voice quiet enough that he did, immediately, without another word, out the door he'd apparently learned to use as an exit more than once. Sarah started talking the moment the door closed. Not composed. Immediate, unraveling, grabbing my hands before I could step back, saying my name over and over, telling me she was sorry, that it wasn't what it looked like even as we both understood it was exactly what it looked like, that she'd never meant for it to become what it became, that she would do anything, if I would just let her explain. I let her explain. I sat down across from her, arms crossed, and let her talk, and something in my own stillness seemed to frighten her more than shouting would have. She cried through most of it, the kind of crying that comes from someone who has genuinely run out of a rehearsed version and is simply telling the truth because there's nothing else left to offer. She told me everything, in her own words, right there on that couch. She said it started the September before, not with Tom exactly, but with a feeling that had been building for over a year, a specific loneliness she said she'd never found the right moment to tell me about, because how do you tell a man who's providing everything for his family that his providing has started to feel like absence? She said the first time Tom really saw her, the actual moment, was an afternoon he'd come by to fix the fence and stayed for coffee, and she'd told herself, that day, that a cup of coffee with a neighbor while her husband traveled meant nothing at all. She said she believed that story completely, for weeks, right up until the day it stopped being true, and she kept telling herself the same story anyway because stopping felt like admitting something about her own marriage she wasn't ready to face, that she had married a good man who had, without either of them planning it, become someone she mostly experienced through a phone screen. She said the escalation happened in small permissions she gave herself. One lunch became a habit became an afternoon, and every single time she told herself this was the last one, she believed it a little less and did it again a little easier. She said the fear was constant, a low hum underneath everything, worse on the days I came home early, worse still on the days Priya was actually in town. And the shame, she said, the shame lived in specific places, not big ones. She couldn't look at the drawing of our family Noah had taped above his bed. She'd started avoiding Priya at the mailbox, inventing reasons to duck back inside, and hated the person that made her. She said there'd been one afternoon in February she'd almost told me everything. I remembered it, the day I came home, and she seemed unusually quiet, and she'd gotten as far as forming the first sentence in her head before deciding the cost of saying it out loud was more than she could survive that particular week, and she pushed it back down, the way she'd been pushing it down since September. When she finished, she was still holding my hands, still crying, still saying she was sorry, still asking what she could do. I looked at her for a long moment. I didn't feel the rage I'd expected to feel, sitting in that car 2 streets over an hour earlier. I felt, mostly, exhausted in a way that went all the way down to something structural. I need you to understand something, I said finally. I've known for 11 weeks. I have the footage. I have the receipt. I wasn't blindsided today. I decided today. I watched that land on her differently than the affair itself had, the understanding that I hadn't discovered this in a moment of accidental exposure, that I'd walked around our house for 2 months, methodically building a case, eating dinner across from her, while she still thought she had time to end it quietly on her own terms. I watched her realize that the man she'd been managing, the one she thought she still had some control over, had already made his decision before she'd finished her sentence about the fence and the coffee. I moved into a rental 2 miles away within 3 weeks. I didn't do it in anger, or at least not only in anger, I did it because I understood, sitting with the full weight of 11 weeks of silence and 1 afternoon of confession, that this wasn't a marriage I could rebuild from the same foundation. Some cracks you can repair. This one had been growing in a part of the structure I could no longer trust myself to inspect honestly, because I'd already proven to myself that I could walk past warning signs for months rather than ask a direct question. The divorce took 8 months. I won't pretend I approached it purely without anger by the end. I hired a good lawyer, and because the affair had been documented so thoroughly, so undeniably, the settlement went almost entirely in my favor. I kept the house. Sarah moved into an apartment across town. We shared custody of Ella and Noah, close to equal, because whatever had broken between the two of us, neither of us believed it should cost the kids more than it already had. Tom's marriage didn't survive it either. Priya found out within the same month. I told her myself, directly, the week after the confrontation, because I decided she deserved the same clarity I'd been denied for a year. She left him within 6 weeks. Last I heard, Tom had put the house on the market and moved to Columbus for a fresh start no one in our old neighborhood was particularly interested in helping him find. Sarah reached out, months later, once the worst of the anger had settled into something calmer on both sides. Not asking for reconciliation, she understood by then that door was permanently closed, but asking if we could find a way to co-parent without the bitterness poisoning Ella and Noah's sense of both of us. I said yes. We've managed, mostly, to build something functional out of what's left, quieter and more careful than what we had before, which is, I've come to understand, sometimes the most honest kind of ending two people can build. I think often about that hook by the back door, the missing key, the very first thread of this whole unraveling. I understand now that I noticed almost everything, month after month, and explained nearly all of it away, because the story where my marriage was simply well adjusted to my travel schedule was so much easier to live inside than the one where I'd become, without meaning to, a husband who was more reliably present in a hotel room than in his own living room. I realized something sitting in that rental the first week, alone for the first time in 12 years, I had spent a decade being good at providing and terrible at noticing, and I had told myself those were the same job. They were never the same job. A house needs someone paying the mortgage. A marriage needs someone actually there to see the person living inside it. I had confused the first for the second for years, and Sarah's loneliness, whatever choices she made with it, grew in exactly the space that confusion left open. What actually collapsed in this story wasn't trust in a single moment, it was two separate, quieter failures that happened to live 40 feet apart from each other, each one feeding the other without either person fully seeing it happen. David's absence wasn't malicious, it was the ordinary cost of a career he believed he owed his family. Sarah's loneliness wasn't manufactured, it was real, and it found its nearest, most convenient answer in a man who happened to be available in exactly the hours David wasn't. The uncomfortable truth this story sits with is that David's 11 weeks of silent evidence gathering wasn't patience or wisdom, it was the same instinct that had made him absent in the first place, just redirected inward. A man who solves problems by working harder alone, rather than bringing someone else into the room to solve them together, will do that in his marriage too, even in a crisis. His methodical case-building protected him from being blindsided, but it also cost Sarah any chance of a conversation that might have happened months earlier, before either of them had hardened into the roles they played out on that couch in March. There's also something worth sitting with in how ordinary the warning signs were. A missing spare key. A disposal that worked fine. A phone that moved from the counter to a back pocket. None of these, on their own, prove anything, and that's exactly the point. Betrayal rarely announces itself with a single dramatic sign. It accumulates in small, deniable increments, precisely because each individual piece is genuinely explainable on its own. The damage isn't in any one lie. It's in how easily reasonable explanations stack into an entirely false picture, if no one is willing to ask the harder question underneath them. What Sarah's confession reveals, more than anything else, is how much of this happened in the space between two true things. She really did love her family, and she really did feel unbearably alone inside a marriage that looked, from the outside, entirely intact. Those two facts don't cancel each other out. They coexisted, uneasily, for over a year, and it was in that uneasy coexistence that the affair found room to grow. I keep coming back to one question this story leaves open: how many marriages are held together not by genuine daily presence, but by a shared agreement not to look too closely at what presence actually requires? The thing that still sits with me most about this story isn't the affair, and it isn't even the confrontation. It's that missing key on the hook by the back door, the very first thread, noticed and let go in under a minute, months before anything else surfaced. That's usually where these stories actually begin. Not with the betrayal itself, but with the moment right before it, when something small and strange crosses your attention and you decide, almost without deciding, that it's easier to keep moving than to stop and ask. I don't think David was a fool for missing it, and I don't think Sarah was simply cruel for choosing what she chose. I think they were two people who'd let the actual, daily work of being present to each other quietly become optional, and a whole year passed before either of them had to face what that cost. If you've ever noticed something small in your own life, a changed habit, a missing key, a laugh that lasted a half-second too long, and told yourself the easier story instead of the true one. You already know exactly why it took David until March to finally look. Tell me one word in the comments. For a moment you saw something small and chose not to ask, or for someone who was standing closer than you ever realized. Thank you for sitting with this one all the way through tonight.